Professor Harsh V Pant is Director and Head of the Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Defence Studies and King's India Institute as Professor of International Relations at King's College, London. He is also a non-resident fellow with the Wadhwani Chair in US-India Policy Studies at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Professor Pant has been a visiting fellow at the Centre for the Advanced Study of India, University of Pennsylvania, a visiting scholar at the Centre for International Peace and Security Studies, McGill University, and an Emerging Leaders Fellow at the Australia-India Institute at the University of Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Professor Pant's current research is focused on Asian security issues. Professor Pant writes regularly for various Indian and international media outlets, including the Japan Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National in the UAE, the Hindustan Times and the Telegraph. Professor Pant, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
You recently edited a report called How Donald Trump Changed the World. Now, that's a great title. What were some of the foreign policy issues examined?
Well, we looked at a range of issues because clearly, as American elections and the results also tell us that while Mr. Trump might be gone now, or for a while at least, we really have not seen the end of what is called or is being described as Trumpism. The elections were relatively more close, were closer than we expected, many expected. And I think the ideas that he has brought forth in some ways will linger on. And what we looked at were both domain-specific issues, like, for example, what he has done to the multilateral order, what he has done to debates on global governance, as well as what he has done in his specific geographies. And I think we found that in a lot of the cases, perhaps his rhetoric and his administration's approach did not quite match. And in some of the cases, what we will find going forward that Mr. Biden, despite his having a very, very different world vision, would find it difficult to reverse what Mr. Trump has done. So I think, for example, if you look at the Indo-Pacific, where I think you and I both are very interested, we are located. The idea that Mr. Trump and the Trump administration is an extremely isolationist one would be very difficult to sustain. He managed, or he pushed, a very, very aggressive or an assertive Indo-Pacific vision. It was not simply related to China, although it was partly related to the so-called conflict with China that has been emerging, but also in terms of his outreach to other countries. Countries like Australia, Japan, India, ASEAN. I think it was an outreach that for the regional states made sense given China's rise. So I think he, despite his idea of despite the idea that he would be reverting back, he was looking inwards, which he was in several cases. In the case of Indo-Pacific, in particular, we found that he was more engaged with the region. And there was and it was welcomed in the region compared to what, say, Mr. Obama was doing. So I think we have to look at Mr. Trump's legacy in terms of in terms of more gradation, in terms of more nuance, than perhaps just saying that Mr. Trump was all about America first.
Was Donald Trump as disruptive as he was accused of when becoming president?
So I think, like all American presidents, Mike, his legacy would be when we look back, we would find that it's a mixed bag. I think in the question of disruption in particular, my sense would be that on the multilateral issues, perhaps we would see his disruption more vividly, more explicitly than say his predecessors, given that he was very unequivocal in terms of taking America out of certain multilateral frameworks like the Paris Accord, for example, or he said things or demanded things from allies and partners which previous American presidents, and I think Mr. Biden himself would in the future, say more diplomatically or behind closed doors. For example, the whole debate on NATO, the idea of burden sharing, that NATO members should be doing more for regional security, for NATO's resilience. Those ideas have been in the public domain for a very long time. We are hearing these debates. We have been hearing these debates right from the time of George W. Bush, and this has been a point of tension between Europe and America. But Mr. Trump was saying it much more publicly. He was willing to risk relations with closest allies on these questions. Similarly, with Japan and with South Korea in Asia, he was also willing to be very explicit, demanding more, that Japan does more or South Korea does more. And I think this idea that other countries should pitch in has been growing in the American establishment, and has been there part of the discourse. But Mr. Trump said it much more undiplomatically, perhaps, and very explicitly. So I think the challenge for future administrations would be to reverse course, or to rebuild ties which have been frayed with closest allies. But I would very much doubt if they would give up on issues which have been part of American foreign policy establishment for a very long time now. So yes, in certain areas, he seemed more disruptive than other presidents because he was willing to go an extra mile and challenge some of the long-held foundations of American foreign policy. But in others, as I was discussing in answer to the first question, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, he seemed more of a traditional American president trying to restore American preeminence in the Indo-Pacific. So I think there are, again, gradations here, and there are, again, nuances here that one needs to look at when assessing Mr. Trump and his disruptive legacy.
What do you think are Donald Trump's greatest achievements on the foreign policy front?
I think without any doubt, Mike, I would say, reorientation of the China question perhaps will be his most important contribution and his most lasting legacy. I think he virtually single-handedly changed the discourse on China in the West in particular. I think a lot of the countries like yours and mine that have been living in China's vicinity now, and have been experiencing a certain kind of an aggression and assertiveness from China. There have been these debates both, in Australia, in India, in Japan, even in certain ASEAN member states about what China is up to in the region. But I think in the West, and we have seen this attempt to make a case or to suggest that somehow engaging with China is the only option, and it would lead to the kind of outcomes perhaps that they were hoping for, which are more productive. And I think Mr. Trump, from the very beginning, challenged the very basis of that assumption, arguing that China has not only benefited more from these engagements, that this is not only a bilateral, this is not only the bilateral relationship between America and China lacks reciprocity, but he also challenged China on other issues like trade and technology in ways that perhaps have never been done before. So, and by the time he's leaving office now, it's very clear that the entire consensus in Washington and the consensus in Western capitals in the West, in Europe, has completely changed. Today, there is a much greater cognizance of the challenge that China poses, and there is a realization that unless China is confronted head-on today, perhaps there'll be no tomorrow. So I think that assessment is very important, and Mr. Trump played a very important part in building that consensus because he was challenging China frontally, without any guard, without any mincing any words. And I think it did two things. It sort of reassured a lot of the Indo-Pacific countries with all the other challenges that perhaps America understood finally the challenge that is emerging. But it also generated in Washington, in Western capitals, a reassessment, a fundamental recalibration of their China policies. And I think that is going to be perhaps his lasting legacy. Even if he does not, come back to power even as he does not come back to politics as he's suggesting by 2024.
Look, we're running out of time, but just quickly, Professor, what do you expect with the Biden administration rescuing Obama's legacy or the great global reset favoured by wealthy globalists and bureaucrats?
I think Mr. Biden will certainly try to resurrect what he perhaps rightly feels that some of the legacy issues of Mr. Obama were discarded by Mr. Trump, and he would try to restore his own vision of a collaborative, consensus-based world order. But I think the challenge that he would face is that even when the time when he was the vice president, say 4 years back, and today, the global order, the global questions have completely changed. And Mr. Trump, whatever he has done in the last few years has also contributed to that. And in some ways, it would be very difficult to restore a status quo ante. And therefore, I don't think, he can go back to those to that era of Obama, seamlessly, because there are two things. One, as I said, the world has changed. Two, America has changed. The America that Mr. Biden would be leading is again today very, very polarized. The questions about America first are not going to go away. He himself has said that he would first prioritize American middle classes, American manufacturing, American industry. So clearly, the idea that somehow he is going to be the kind of a free trader that of the high noon of Clintonian internationalism, that's not going to happen. He will find it very difficult to restore the status quo ante, which he has promised, partly because a lot of things have happened in between. So even something like JCPOA, like the Iranian nuclear deal, for example, that Mr. Trump junked, I'm not so sure how easy it would be for Mr. Biden to restore it. Partly because, in some ways, the challenge for him would be that Middle East itself has undergone a dramatic transformation. The Middle East today, where Israel and Saudi Arabia seem to be contemplating a normalization, is a very different Middle East of Mr. Obama. And so for Mr. Biden, who has again said that he would work with allies and partners, how he manages these contradictions would remain a very important part of his legacy. And therefore, it may not be very, very easy for him to go back to that status quo ante. But certainly the direction of his engagement with the world, as he put it, would be about restoring, which he feels that America has lost the edge, and he would try to situate America right at the center of global debates, discussions, multilateral order. And I think a large part of the world would welcome that, because we need a leadership at a time from America where leadership seems to be in short supply. But whether he's able to do that on a sustainable basis, given the challenges that Mr. Biden faces both at home and abroad, again remains to be seen. But I think he has already indicated that some of the appointments that he has made are more in the traditional mold, perhaps indicating his desire to make American foreign policy less unpredictable and more in tune with some of the long-term fundamentals of American foreign policy thinking.
Undoubtedly, a few exciting weeks coming up still, because we don't know whether Trump will end up still being president. Depends on the courts, of course, and a toss of a coin almost. Who knows, Professor, what will happen? It certainly makes good reading, and appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you, Mike.